Businessman doctor ignores the new nurse until she solves a diagnosis that 10 specialists got wrong. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, have you ever had a gut feeling that turned out to be right when everyone else was wrong? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Dr. Alistair Cromwell's world was a fortress of data. His kingdom, the Cromwell Institute for Advanced Diagnostics, a chain of elite, private clinics, was built on a foundation of unshakable logic. For Alistair, medicine was not an art, it was a high-stakes mathematical equation. Patients were not people. They were complex data sets, collections of symptoms, biomarkers, and genetic predispositions. And emotions? Emotions were rounding errors, messy, unpredictable variables that had no place in the clean, sterile pursuit of a diagnosis. This philosophy had made him a legend in the medical and business communities. At 42, he was a brilliant physician and a ruthless CEO. A man who could spot a flaw in a corporate balance sheet as easily as he could in a patient's blood work. But it had also turned him into an island, a man surrounded by the best and the brightest, yet utterly alone. His interactions were transactions, his conversations were data exchanges, and his heart was the most heavily guarded, sterile room in his entire institute. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hand, not on the anxious elderly woman sitting in front of him. "Your cortisol levels are elevated, your inflammatory markers are slightly up, and your sleep patterns show a 15% deviation from the norm. The data suggests a mild, stress-induced autoimmune response. I'm prescribing a course of corticosteroids and a stricter dietary regimen." "But doctor," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly, I feel so sad since my husband passed. I feel lonely." Alistair looked up, a flicker of impatience in his sharp gray eyes. "Grief is an emotional response, Mrs. Gable. It is not a medical diagnosis. The data points to inflammation. We will treat the inflammation. My assistant will schedule a follow-up in 6 weeks." He stood up, a clear dismissal, and walked out, leaving the woman sitting alone with her loneliness, a problem for which he had no prescription. Into this world of cold, hard data walked Clara Monroe. She was the newest nurse on the VIP floor, a position no one wanted for long. Working directly under Dr. Cromwell was notoriously difficult. Clara, however, was different. She had graduated at the top of her class from one of the best nursing programs in the country, but she had deliberately chosen to work at a smaller, patient-focused clinic rather than a high-pressure, research-driven hospital. She believed that healing was a partnership, not a transaction. She believed in listening. On her first day, she spent 20 minutes holding the hand of a patient who was terrified of getting his blood drawn, talking to him about his grandchildren until he had completely forgotten about the needle. She noticed that another patient wasn't eating his meals, and instead of just marking it on a chart, she sat with him and discovered that the hospital food reminded him of his late wife's terrible cooking, so she arranged for him to have a simple sandwich and soup instead. He ate every bite. She saw the people behind the charts, and in the world of Alistair Cromwell, this made her a dangerous and entirely unquantifiable variable. The collision of their two worlds was inevitable, and it arrived in the form of an 8-year-old boy named Thomas Ashford. Thomas was the son of one of the Institute's most powerful investors, a child who had been a vibrant, energetic force of nature until 3 months ago. Now, he was a medical mystery. He was plagued by debilitating fatigue, strange, migrating rashes that appeared and disappeared without a pattern, and a deep, aching pain in his joints that left him in tears. Alistair had thrown the full weight of the Cromwell Institute at the boy's case. He had brought in 10 of the best specialists in the country, a top neurologist from Johns Hopkins, a renowned immunologist from the Mayo Clinic, a leading geneticist from Stanford. They had run every test imaginable: MRIs, PET scans, spinal taps, full genetic sequencing. The results were maddeningly inconclusive. Every test came back normal. "It makes no sense," Alistair growled, pacing the conference room, the faces of the 10 specialists looking back at him from a giant video screen. "The data is clean, yet the patient is deteriorating. What are we missing?" A chorus of stumped academic responses filled the room. "Perhaps a rare, undocumented viral strain." It could be a psychosomatic response to stress. We need to run the genetic panel again. While the titans of medicine debated, Clara Monroe was doing her job. She had been assigned as Thomas's primary care nurse. She was the one who was in the room when the doctors weren't. She was the one who held the cool cloth to his forehead, who read him stories, who sat with him during the long, painful nights. And she was the one who was observing. She didn't have access to the complex medical data, but she was gathering a different kind of data. Human data. She noticed that the boy's rashes seemed to flare up after he ate meals containing red food dye. She noticed that his joint pain was always worse on days when the sun was particularly bright, and he would squint and complain of headaches. She noticed that he had a strange aversion to the smell of the cleaning products used in the hospital, often holding his breath when the janitorial staff came into the room, and she noticed his drawings. Thomas was a talented little artist, and his hospital room was covered in pictures. Most were of superheroes and spaceships, but there was one recurring, strange image. A drawing of himself being chased by what he called the spiky monster, a creature made of sharp, angry, red lines. Clara started keeping a small, private journal, a simple notebook where she meticulously documented her observations, the time of each meal and the ingredients, the intensity of the sunlight in his room, the exact time the cleaners came by. It was a pattern, she thought. There had to be a pattern. One afternoon, armed with her small notebook and a large dose of courage, she found Alistair in the hallway outside Thomas's room. "Dr. Cromwell," she began, her voice steady. "I know it's not my place, but I've noticed a few things about Thomas's condition. I think there might be a connection between his symptoms and his environment." Alistair turned to her, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Nurse Monroe, your job is to administer medication and monitor vitals, not to play detective. We have 10 of the world's leading specialists on this case. I assure you, if there were an environmental trigger, they would have found it." "With all due respect, sir," Clara pressed, her resolve firming. "They are looking at his blood work. I am looking at him. He told me the spiky monster in his drawings comes out when he eats the red jello, or when the cleaning cart is in the hallway." Alistair's face hardened. "Feelings and children's drawings are not diagnostic tools, nurse. We deal in science here, in verifiable facts. Are we clear?" "Yes, doctor," Clara said, but the look in her eyes was not one of submission. It was one of profound disappointment. "Good," he said, turning his back on her and striding down the hall. "Stick to your duties. Let the experts handle the diagnosis." Clara stood in the hallway, her notebook clutched in her hand, the dismissal stinging more than she had expected. She looked through the window into Thomas's room, where the small boy was listlessly looking at a book, his face pale and drawn. The experts were failing him. The data was failing him. She knew in that moment that she couldn't just stick to her duties. Her most important duty was to the child in that room. And if the 10 greatest medical minds in the country couldn't see the story that was right in front of them, then she would have to find a way to make them read it. That night, long after her shift had ended, Clara didn't go home. She went to the Institute's vast, silent medical library. Surrounded by the towering shelves of medical knowledge, she opened her small, humble notebook. She had a list of seemingly unrelated symptoms: a sensitivity to red dye, photosensitivity, a reaction to chemical smells, joint pain, and fatigue. On their own, they meant nothing. But together they had to tell a story. She started her research. She pulled down heavy textbooks on immunology, on toxicology, on rare genetic disorders. She cross-referenced her notes with online medical databases, diving deep into the digital rabbit hole of case studies and research papers. The hours ticked by. The library grew colder. But Clara was fueled by a fierce, protective energy. It was almost 3 a.m. when she found it. It wasn't in a major medical journal. It was a small, almost forgotten article in an obscure European publication on environmental medicine. The article described a rare, multisystemic hypersensitivity disorder, a condition where the body's immune system overreacts to a specific group of common, everyday chemicals and compounds. The list of triggers was chillingly familiar: certain artificial food colorings, specific chemical compounds found in industrial cleaning agents, and a rare photosensitivity triggered by certain types of fluorescent lighting. The symptoms listed in the article were a perfect match for Thomas's: migrating rashes, joint inflammation, debilitating fatigue, headaches. It was a condition so rare and so often misdiagnosed as psychosomatic that most specialists would never even consider it. It wasn't something you could find on a standard blood test. You could only find it by observing the patient, by listening to their story. Her heart pounding, Clara printed out the article. This was it. This was the answer. It was a long shot, a theory based on a little boy's drawings and a nurse's observations, but every instinct in her body told her it was right. She walked through the dark, silent institute, the article clutched in her hand. She knew what she had to do. She had to go back to Alistair Cromwell. She had to make him listen. She found his office light still on. He was there, a solitary figure in the vast, empty building, staring at a screen of inconclusive data, a king trapped in his own fortress of facts. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping a sharp, decisive rhythm. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Nurse Monroe, what are you doing here at this hour?" She didn't answer. She just walked to his desk, placed her worn notebook beside his state-of-the-art tablet, and laid the printed medical article on top of it. "You're right, doctor," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an unshakable power. "Feelings are not diagnostic tools." She tapped the article. "But they are data. And you've been reading the wrong chart." Alistair stared at the documents on his desk as if they were alien artifacts. On one side was his expensive, glowing tablet, displaying millions of dollars worth of inconclusive genetic data. On the other was Clara's simple, spiral-bound notebook, filled with handwritten observations about sunlight and red jello, and a single, obscure medical article printed on cheap paper. His entire professional instinct, the very core of his data-driven philosophy, screamed at him to dismiss her, to call her theory a desperate, unprofessional long shot. He picked up the article. The journal was one he had never heard of. The author was a doctor from a small university in Belgium, not a brand name from Harvard or Yale. Everything about it felt unsubstantiated. Multisystemic hypersensitivity, he read the title aloud, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Nurse, this is a fringe diagnosis. It's a catch-all term for symptoms that can't be explained. It's barely recognized by mainstream medicine." "Is that because it's not real?" Clara countered, her voice steady, "or because it can't be measured by the tests you're used to running?" She tapped her notebook. "The evidence is right here. Not in his blood, but in his life. Every time he's exposed to one of the triggers listed in that article, the cleaning solvents, the food dyes, the lighting in the MRI machine, his symptoms flare up. It's a perfect correlation." "Correlation is not causation," he shot back, the words a reflex, a line of defense for his crumbling worldview. "This is anecdotal evidence. It's the talk of a frightened child and the observations of a nurse." The word hung in the air, weighted with his intended condescension. But Clara didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, her chin high. "The nurse, the one who is actually in the room with him for more than 5 minutes a day. The one who is listening." Her words were a direct hit, a clean, sharp strike against the armor of his arrogance. He looked at her, at the quiet, unshakable conviction in her eyes, and then back at the pages of his own failed reports. 10 of the world's best specialists, millions of dollars in testing, and they had found nothing. She, with a notebook and a few hours in the library, had found a story, a pattern, a plausible theory that, as much as he hated to admit it, made a terrifying amount of sense. He was a scientist, above all else. And a true scientist does not dismiss a hypothesis without testing it. He let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of profound defeat and reluctant curiosity. "Fine," he said, the word costing him a considerable amount of pride. "We'll test your theory." He stood up, the CEO taking back control, but with a new, uncertain edge to his voice. "Starting immediately, we create a controlled environment. We eliminate every potential trigger you've identified from Thomas's room. No artificial dyes in his food. We'll use only natural, organic cleaning products. We'll replace the fluorescent bulbs with full-spectrum natural light lamps. We will, for the next 48 hours, treat your observations as our primary protocol." He looked at her, his gray eyes narrowed. "But let's be clear, Nurse Monroe. If this is a wild goose chase, if his condition shows no improvement, your tenure at this institute will be over. You will have wasted the time of my entire team, and more importantly, you will have given a sick child and his family false hope. Do you understand the stakes?" "I do," Clara said without a moment's hesitation. "And I'm willing to bet my career on it." He stared at her, this quiet, unassuming woman who was willing to risk everything on her own conviction. He hadn't seen that kind of courage in one of his boardrooms in years. "Then let's begin," he said. The next 48 hours were a tense, surreal experiment. Alistair put the full resources of the Institute behind Clara's protocol. The hospital's kitchens were given a strict new menu for Thomas, devoid of any artificial colors or preservatives. The janitorial staff was issued a new set of all-natural, unscented cleaning supplies for his room. Maintenance crews worked through the night to replace the lighting fixtures. The team of 10 specialists was put on standby, their multi-million-dollar tests paused. Alistair could feel their collective skepticism, their professional pride wounded by the fact that they were now following the lead of a nurse. He didn't care. His focus was singular: the data. He wanted to see the results. He and Clara became an unlikely team of researchers, spending nearly every waking hour in a small observation room next to Thomas's, monitoring his vitals and documenting every small change. At first there was nothing. For the first 12 hours, Thomas remained lethargic, his skin still marked by the faint, angry rash. Alistair felt a knot of "I told you so" tightening in his gut, but Clara remained calm. "It takes time for the system to clear," she said, her eyes fixed on the monitors. "We have to be patient." Patience was not one of Alistair's virtues, but he waited. The first change came around the 24-hour mark. It was subtle. The angry red of the rash on Thomas's arms began to fade, softening to a pale pink. "His histamine levels are dropping," Alistair murmured, looking at the real-time vitals on his screen. "By 10%. It was a small change, but it was statistically significant. By the morning of the second day, the change was undeniable. Thomas woke up, and for the first time in weeks, he asked for a real breakfast, not just broth. The rash was almost completely gone. He sat up in bed, his movements less pained, and started to work on a new drawing. Clara and Alistair watched on the monitor as Thomas's parents, who had been cautiously informed of the new environmental protocol, entered the room. "Mommy," Thomas said, his voice clearer than it had been in months. "I'm hungry." The boy's mother burst into tears of relief, rushing to hug her son. In the observation room, a profound silence settled between Alistair and Clara. The evidence was right there on the screen, in the sound of a little boy's happy chatter. She had been right, utterly, completely, and devastatingly right. Alistair felt a wave of emotions so complex he couldn't name them all. Humiliation at his own arrogance and blindness, awe at her incredible intuition and dedication, and a deep, humbling sense of gratitude that was completely foreign to him. He turned to look at her. She was watching the family on the screen, a quiet, beautiful smile on her face. There was no triumph in her expression, no "I told you so." There was only a profound, selfless joy for the child she had helped to heal. "You did it," he said, his voice a raw whisper. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes shining. "No," she said softly. "We did. You were the one who had the courage to listen." He wanted to say more. He wanted to apologize, properly this time. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to tell her that she was the most remarkable person he had ever met. But the words wouldn't come. His entire vocabulary of control and command was useless here. Later that afternoon, he called an emergency video conference with the 10 specialists. He didn't mince words. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cold and clear. "For the past 3 months, we have been failing our patient. We have subjected him to invasive, expensive, and ultimately useless tests, all while overlooking the most obvious evidence. We were so focused on our own complex theories that we failed to do the most basic thing: listen to the patient." He then proceeded to lay out Clara's observations, the article she had found, and the dramatic, undeniable results of the past 48 hours. The diagnosis, he concluded, is not some rare, undocumented virus. It is a severe, multisystemic hypersensitivity, and the credit for this discovery belongs entirely to a member of our nursing staff, Clara Monroe, whose diligent, compassionate observation achieved what our combined expertise could not. The virtual room was filled with a stunned silence. He had not just presented a new diagnosis, He had delivered a brutal indictment of their collective failure. "All of you will remain on the case," he continued. "But from now on, your role will be to support Nurse Monroe's treatment protocol. You will work with her to refine the environmental controls and to research therapeutic options. She is now the lead on this case. Is that understood?" It was an unprecedented move, a complete upending of the hospital's rigid hierarchy. A nurse leading a team of the world's most renowned doctors. It was professional heresy, but no one dared to argue. The evidence was irrefutable, and the command in Alistair's voice was absolute. After the call, he found Clara in the now empty observation room, quietly cleaning up the coffee cups. "I heard what you did," she said, not looking at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said, walking over to stand beside her. "I made a mistake, Clara. A terrible one. I dismissed you, I belittled your professional opinion, and I put my own pride ahead of the well-being of a child. That is a failure I will not repeat." He finally looked at her. "I have never in my life said this to an employee, but I was wrong. And you were right, and I am deeply sorry." The apology was simple, direct, and completely sincere. Clara finally looked up at him, and she saw the profound shift in his eyes. The cold, calculating CEO was gone. In his place was a man humbled by the truth. "Apology accepted, doctor," she said, a small, genuine smile finally returning to her face. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice hesitant. This changes things. Your role here. The board will want to recognize you, a promotion, a research grant, whatever you want. The institute is yours to command, in a way." She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the bustling city below. "I don't want to command anything, Alistair," she said, using his first name for the first time, the sound of it a quiet intimacy in the small room. "I just want to help people. That's all I've ever wanted." He looked at her, at this incredible, brilliant woman who had the world at her fingertips and wanted nothing more than to serve it. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that his own world had just been fundamentally and permanently changed. He hadn't just found a diagnosis, he had found a new direction, and it was pointing straight towards her. The Cromwell Institute, a place once governed by the unshakable laws of hierarchy and data, had been thrown into a state of quiet, revolutionary chaos. The news that Nurse Clara Monroe was now leading the Ashford case, with a team of 10 world-renowned specialists reporting to her, spread through the sterile hallways like a virus for which there was no cure. Nurses whispered in the break rooms, doctors exchanged stunned, incredulous looks over their charts, and the administrative staff spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. It was unprecedented. It was unthinkable. And it was all anyone could talk about. Clara felt the shift in atmosphere the moment she walked onto the VIP floor the next morning. People who had once looked through her now met her eyes, their expressions a mixture of awe, curiosity, and in some cases, resentment. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a symbol, a walking, talking disruption to the natural order of things. Her new reality was both exhilarating and terrifying. She spent her days in the conference room, the same room where Alistair had once dismissed her, now sitting at the head of the table. The 10 specialists, appearing on the large video screen like a council of humbled elders, listened as she outlined her treatment plan for Thomas. It was a strange and surreal experience. She would propose an idea based on her ongoing, meticulous observation of the boy. "I've noticed Thomas's joint pain seems to lessen when he has a diet rich in omega-3s. I'd like to consult with a nutritionist to develop a meal plan centered around that," she would say. And a world-renowned immunologist from the Mayo Clinic, a man who had written the textbook on the subject, would nod and reply, "An excellent, patient-centric approach, Nurse Monroe. We will coordinate that immediately." She handled it with a quiet, unshakable grace. She never gloated. She never once said, "I told you so." She simply did the work. She listened to the specialists' suggestions, incorporated their expertise, and guided the team with a collaborative spirit that was the complete antithesis of Alistair's former top-down command. She was a natural leader, not because she sought power, but because she sought solutions. Alistair, for his part, had taken a step back, but he was always there, a silent, supportive presence in the back of the room. He watched her, amazed. He saw how she could diffuse a tense debate between two egotistical doctors with a simple, common-sense question. He saw how she could explain a complex biological process to Thomas's anxious parents using a simple, beautiful analogy. She was not just a nurse or a diagnostician. She was a healer in the truest sense of the word. Their own interactions became a delicate, undefined dance. The professional line was now hopelessly blurred. He was still the CEO of the Institute, her ultimate boss, but on the Ashford case, she was his. They would spend hours together, reviewing Thomas's progress, discussing new research, their conversations a seamless blend of medical science and human intuition. His sleep patterns have improved by 30% since we installed the air purifier, he would say, pointing to a data chart on his tablet. I know, she would reply, not looking at the chart. I can see it in his drawings. The spiky monster isn't as spiky anymore. He found himself looking forward to their late-night sessions, not just for the case updates, but for the conversations that followed. After they had discussed Thomas, they would talk about other things. He would ask about her day, about the other children on the ward. She would ask about the pressures of running an empire. He learned about the small, worn book of poetry she kept in her locker, the one she read to the children who couldn't sleep. She learned about the secret passion he had for classical music, the one thing that had connected him to his distant, demanding father. They were building a friendship, a deep, respectful connection forged in the quiet hours of a shared purpose. But underneath it, something else was simmering, a powerful, unspoken attraction that both of them were too afraid, or perhaps too professional, to acknowledge. The outside world, of course, did not remain silent. The story of the miracle diagnosis at the Cromwell Institute began to leak. A grateful parent of another child on the ward, who happened to be a local journalist, wrote a small, human interest piece about the dedicated nurse who had solved a medical mystery. The story was picked up by a larger news syndicate. Within a week, Clara Monroe was a local hero. The media attention made Alastair's board of directors extremely nervous. Alastair, this is a PR nightmare waiting to happen. One of his oldest board members, a man named Richard Prescott, told him in a tense phone call. We have a nurse, an employee with no advanced degree, leading one of our most high-profile cases. It makes the Institute and your leadership look unstable. It makes our world-class specialists look incompetent. Our world-class specialists were incompetent in this case, Alastair replied coldly. Clara Monroe succeeded where they failed. That is the only fact that matters. The fact that matters, Alastair, is that she is your employee. And I have heard whispers that your relationship with her is not purely professional. Alastair felt a surge of cold anger. My relationship with Nurse Monroe is based on a profound professional respect for her extraordinary abilities, he said, his voice clipped. And I would advise you not to listen to gossip, Richard. But the warning shot had been fired. Alastair knew he was walking a tightrope. He had to support Clara, but he also had to protect the Institute and himself from the inevitable backlash. The backlash arrived in the form of a formal complaint, filed with the State Medical Board. It was anonymous, but Alastair had no doubt who was behind it. It was a coalition of the specialists from the case, their professional pride wounded, their egos bruised. The complaint alleged that a patient's care was being managed by an unqualified individual, that Dr. Alastair Cromwell was engaging in reckless and unprofessional conduct. An official investigation was launched. They're trying to destroy her, Alastair said to his legal team, his voice a low growl. They couldn't beat her with science, so now they're trying to beat her with bureaucracy. He found Clara in the hospital's small, quiet chapel. She was sitting in a pew, not praying, just staring at the stained glass window, her face pale. I heard about the complaint, he said, sitting down beside her. They're saying I'm a fraud, she said, her voice a hollow whisper. They're saying I'm a danger to my patients. They're wrong, he said fiercely, and we are going to prove it. How? She asked, turning to look at him, her eyes full of a weary despair. They're the experts. They have the titles, the degrees, the reputations. I'm just a nurse with a notebook. No, he said, his voice softening as he reached out and took her hand. Her hand was cold, and he wrapped his own around it, a silent offering of warmth and strength. You are not just a nurse. You are the heart of this entire institute. And they have made a very, very big mistake. They have mistaken your kindness for weakness." He squeezed her hand. "Now we're going to show them what your kind of strength really looks like." The medical board hearing was scheduled for a Friday. It was a cold, formal affair held in a sterile government building. The room was filled with lawyers, board members, and the 10 specialists who sat together, a united front of academic authority. Clara was terrified. She had spent her life helping people, not defending herself in a quasi-legal tribunal. "Just tell the truth," Alistair had told her that morning, his hand on her shoulder, a steady, reassuring presence. "That's the one thing they can't refute." When Clara was called to speak, she walked to the podium with her small, worn notebook in her hand. She didn't talk about medical jargon or complex theories. She told a story. "My name is Clara Monroe," she began, her voice trembling slightly at first but gaining strength with every word. "And I am a nurse. My job is not just to administer medication or read charts. My job is to see the patient. For the past several months, my patient has been an 8-year-old boy named Thomas Ashford." She proceeded to walk the board through her observations, using her notebook as her guide. She didn't present it as a diagnosis. She presented it as a narrative. She told them about the red jello, about the sunlight, about the spiky monster in his drawings. She painted a picture of a little boy whose own body was telling a story that no one had been listening to. "I am not a specialist," she concluded, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the doctors who had tried to ruin her. "I do not have a PhD or a prestigious research grant, but I have what every caregiver in the world has: the ability to observe, to listen, and to care. And in this case, that was the only tool that mattered." She finished, and a profound silence filled the room. Then, the lead lawyer for the specialist stood up. "While Nurse Monroe's story is touching," he said with a condescending smile, "it is not science. It is a collection of anecdotes. Where is the verifiable proof? Where is the data?" Before Clara could respond, a new voice cut through the room. "The data is right here." Alistair Cromwell strode to the front of the room. He was not dressed as a CEO. He was wearing his doctor's white coat. "I am Dr. Alistair Cromwell, Thomas Ashford's primary physician," he said, addressing the board. He proceeded to deliver a presentation that was a masterpiece of scientific validation. He presented charts showing the direct, undeniable correlation between the removal of the environmental triggers and the dramatic improvement in Thomas's condition. He presented before and after blood work showing the steep decline in inflammatory markers. He presented a detailed, peer-reviewed analysis of the Belgian study Clara had found, demonstrating its scientific validity. "The lawyer for the opposition is correct," Alistair said, his gaze sweeping over the 10 specialists. "Anecdotes are not science, but when anecdotes form a consistent, repeatable pattern, and when that pattern leads to a testable hypothesis that results in a verifiable, positive outcome for the patient, that is not an anecdote. That is the very definition of the scientific method." He turned to the board. "The real unprofessional conduct in this case was not Nurse Monroe's. It was ours. It was the collective failure of 10 of the world's best doctors, including myself, to see past our own biases. We were so busy looking at the complex data that we missed the simple truth. Clara Monroe did not endanger her patient. She saved him. She saved him from our ignorance." His confession was stunning, a public act of professional humility that left the entire room speechless. The board's decision came an hour later. The complaint was dismissed. Clara was not only cleared of all wrongdoing, but the board issued a formal commendation for her exceptional and innovative patient-centric care. As they walked out of the hearing room, Clara was mobbed by reporters. Alistair stood back, letting her have the moment. She handled their questions with a grace and intelligence that made his heart swell with pride. Later, after the crowds had dispersed, they found themselves alone on the steps of the government building, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the twilight. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice full of an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. "You didn't have to risk your own reputation to defend me." He turned to her, his expression serious, his gray eyes full of a light she had never seen before. "Yes, I did," he said, "because it's what partners do, and whether you've admitted it to yourself yet or not, Clara Monroe, that's what we are." He didn't wait for a reply. He just hailed a cab, opened the door for her, and for the first time he followed her inside, sitting beside her not as a boss, not as a colleague, but as a man who had finally, completely, chosen his side. And it was, without a doubt, hers. The victory at the medical board hearing was a public vindication, but in the quiet, private spaces of their lives, it created a new and delicate complexity. The power dynamic between them had been irrevocably altered. Alistair was no longer just the CEO who had seen the light. He was the man who had publicly declared himself her partner, her defender. And Clara was no longer the brilliant but overlooked nurse. She was a celebrated innovator, a woman whose name was now whispered with respect in the very hallways where she had once been invisible. They had won the war, but now they had to navigate the peace. And peace, they soon discovered, was a far more complicated battlefield. In the weeks that followed, a new routine settled in. They were an undeniable team at the Institute. They would make rounds together, a strange and powerful duo. He, with his deep analytical knowledge of the science, and she, with her intuitive, holistic understanding of the patient. They would stand by Thomas Ashford's bedside, discussing his progress. The boy was thriving. With the environmental triggers removed and a new, holistic treatment plan in place, he was slowly but surely returning to the vibrant, energetic child he had been. His laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now echoed through the ward. Their professional synergy was flawless. But outside the sterile confines of the hospital, the lines were blurry. He would invite her to dinner, framing it as a strategy session for a new foundation he was planning. She would accept, telling herself it was for the good of the project. They would sit in quiet, elegant restaurants, a world away from the hospital cafeteria, and talk for hours. They would discuss fundraising models and patient outreach programs, but underneath the professional jargon, a different conversation was happening. A conversation of shared glances, of easy laughter, of a deep and growing intimacy that both of them were too afraid to name. "You're a natural at this," he told her one evening, after she had effortlessly charmed a potential donor with a heartfelt story about one of the children on the ward. "You can connect with people in a way I never could." "That's because I see them as people, not as potential investments," she replied, a gentle tease in her voice. "You're learning, though. You almost made eye contact with the waiter tonight." He laughed, a real uninhibited sound that still surprised her. "It's a work in progress," he admitted. He wanted more. He wanted to break free from the safe, professional pretext of their meetings. He wanted to take her to a concert, to a museum, to walk in the park without a project to discuss. He wanted a real date, but he was terrified. He, a man who could navigate a hostile takeover without breaking a sweat, was utterly terrified of asking a nurse out on a date. He was afraid she would say no, afraid that he would push too hard too soon and shatter the fragile, beautiful thing they were building. Clara, for her part, was just as conflicted. She was falling for him, deeply and irrevocably. She loved the man he was becoming, the kind, humble, and surprisingly funny man who was emerging from behind the icy facade of the CEO. But she was also fiercely protective of her own identity. She had fought so hard to be recognized for her skills, for her mind. She was terrified that if she became Alistair Cromwell's girlfriend, all of that would be erased. She would once again be defined by the powerful man beside her, her own accomplishments reduced to a footnote in his story, and that was a price she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. So they remained in their comfortable, professional limbo, two people deeply in love, but trapped by their own fears and the ghosts of their pasts. The thing that finally forced their hand was, as it had always been, Thomas Ashford. The boy was scheduled to be discharged from the hospital, a milestone that was a testament to Clara's brilliance and Alistair's willingness to change. The Institute was planning a small celebration. Thomas's parents, eternally grateful, insisted that both Alistair and Clara be there as the guests of honor. The celebration was held in the hospital's sunny, newly renovated playroom. It was a simple affair, with balloons, a sheet cake, and a room full of happy children and tearful, grateful parents. Thomas, looking healthy and vibrant, ran around with his friends, a superhero cape tied around his small shoulders. "I can't thank you enough," Thomas's mother said to Clara, her eyes shining with tears. "You didn't just heal my son. You gave our family its life back." Thomas is a fighter, Clara said, her own voice thick with emotion. I just helped give him the right tools to win. Alistair stood at the edge of the room, watching Clara as she knelt down to talk to a small, shy girl in a wheelchair. He saw the genuine warmth in her smile, the easy compassion in her touch. And in that moment, a profound, unshakable certainty settled in his heart. He didn't care about the board, about the gossip, about the optics. A life without this woman in it was not a life he was willing to live. After the party, as they were walking through the quiet hospital corridors, he stopped. "Clara," he said, his voice serious. "Yes? I can't do this anymore." Her heart dropped. "Do what?" "This," he said, gesturing to the space between them. "This professional, respectful, careful distance. It's not real. It's not what I feel, and I don't want to live a life that isn't real anymore." He took a step closer, his gray eyes intense. "I am in love with you, Clara Monroe. Not because you're a brilliant nurse who saved my institute. Not because you're a symbol of compassionate care. But because you are the kindest, strongest, most stubbornly wonderful person I have ever met. I love your mind, I love your heart, and I am tired of pretending that I can be satisfied with just being your colleague." She was speechless, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know you're afraid," he continued, his voice softening. "I know you're worried about losing yourself, about being overshadowed, but I'm making you a promise. I will never be the man who stands in your light. I will be the man who stands beside you, making sure the whole world sees how brightly you shine." He took a deep breath. "Go out with me, Clara? A real date, no hospital business, no fundraising talk, just you and me. Let me show you that the man who is in love with you is not the same man who was your boss." She looked at him, at the raw, honest vulnerability in his eyes, and the last of her fears dissolved. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes people just need someone to be brave first. "Okay, Alistair," she whispered, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. "I'd like that very much." Their first date was a study in beautiful, awkward normalcy. He showed up at her small, humble apartment, not in a chauffeured limousine, but in his own car. He wore a simple, casual sweater and jeans, and he was holding a single perfect gardenia. "I remembered you said it was your favorite," he said, looking endearingly nervous. She didn't take him to a fancy, Michelin-starred restaurant. She took him to a small, family-owned jazz club in a basement in Greenwich Village, a place with mismatched chairs and a piano that was slightly out of tune. The air was thick with the smell of spilled beer and the sound of soulful, improvisational music. It was a world away from his usual haunts, and he loved every second of it. He saw her in her element, her face alive with the music, her body swaying to the rhythm. She told him stories about the musicians, about the history of the club, about the magic of a city that held 1,000,000 different worlds within it. He, in turn, opened up in a way he never had before. He told her about his failed attempts to learn the saxophone as a teenager, about his secret love for old black and white noir films, about the profound loneliness he had felt for years, a loneliness he hadn't even been able to name until she came into his life. They weren't Dr. Cromwell and Nurse Monroe. They were just Alistair and Clara, two people discovering the beautiful, messy, and exhilarating landscape of each other's souls. On the drive home, as he pulled up in front of her building, a comfortable silence settled between them. "I had a wonderful time tonight," she said softly. "Me too," he replied, his voice a low murmur. He turned off the engine, and in the quiet intimacy of the car, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle, questioning kiss at first, a test of the waters. She responded, her lips soft and warm against his, a silent answer to the question his heart had been asking for months. The kiss deepened, a slow, beautiful unfolding of all the pent-up emotion, the respect, the admiration, the deep, abiding love that had grown between them. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. "So," she said, a playful smile on her lips, her eyes shining in the dim light of the street lamp. "What's the data on that?" He laughed, a deep, happy sound that seemed to fill the entire car. "The data," he said, leaning in to kiss her again, "is overwhelmingly positive." The weeks that followed were a blur of falling in love. It was a quiet, private affair. They kept their relationship out of the office, not out of fear, but out of a shared desire to let it grow in its own time, in its own space. They explored the city together, hand in hand, finding joy in the simple things. Walks in Central Park, lazy Sunday mornings with the newspaper, trying to cook together in her tiny kitchen, and usually ending up ordering takeout. He met her family, a loud, loving, chaotic group, who subjected him to a rigorous but good-natured interrogation and then promptly adopted him as one of their own. She, in turn, began to fill the empty spaces in his mansion, not just with her laughter and her books, but with her presence. The sterile house began to feel like a home. But the real world, with its expectations and its judgments, was still out there. And they both knew that sooner or later, they would have to face it. The moment came in the form of an invitation to the annual Physicians' Foundation Ball, the most prestigious medical event of the year. Alistair was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award. "You have to be there," he said to her, his expression a mixture of hope and anxiety. "By my side, not as my colleague, as my partner." It was the moment she had been dreading and dreaming of. It was their public debut, a statement to the world and to the powerful, judgmental medical community that she was not just his employee, but his equal. "I'll be there," she said, her voice full of a new, quiet confidence. "But I'm choosing the dress." The week leading up to the Physicians' Foundation Ball was a strange and surreal experience for Clara. Her life, which had so recently been a quiet rhythm of hospital shifts and library research, was suddenly invaded by the high-stakes world of couture and social protocol. Alistair, in his own well-meaning but slightly clumsy way, had tried to make it easier for her. He had arranged for a personal shopper, a woman with a terrifyingly chic haircut and a judgmental stare, to visit Clara's apartment with an army of designer gowns. Clara had survived for exactly 15 minutes before politely but firmly showing the woman the door. "What's wrong?" Alistair had asked over the phone, a hint of panic in his voice. "Did she not have your size?" "No, she had my size," Clara had replied, laughing. "She just didn't have my soul." "Alistair, I can't wear a dress that costs more than my entire college education. I wouldn't be me. I'd be a character in a play, and I'm a terrible actress." He had sighed, a sound of frustrated understanding. "So what are you going to wear?" "Something that tells my story," she had said, a new quiet determination in her voice. She spent the next few days not in high-end boutiques, but in the fabric district, in small, independent designer studios, and in long conversations with a talented young seamstress she had met through one of the hospital's community outreach programs. Together they designed a dress. It wasn't about labels or trends. It was about her. It was a deep, midnight blue, the color of the quiet hours she had spent in the library. The fabric was simple, elegant silk, but the neckline and sleeves were adorned with a delicate, hand-embroidered pattern of herbs and flowers, a subtle, beautiful nod to the healing arts, to the world of nursing that was her true calling. Alistair, respecting her wishes, didn't see the dress until the night of the ball. When he arrived at her apartment to pick her up, he was rendered completely, utterly speechless. She stood in her small, book-filled living room, and she was breathtaking. The dress was a perfect reflection of her, understated, intelligent, and lit from within by a quiet, profound beauty. "Clara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, You look like a constellation." She smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "And you, Dr. Cromwell, you clean up pretty well yourself." He was wearing a classic, perfectly tailored tuxedo, but tonight it didn't look like armor. It just looked like a suit. The man wearing it was no longer the cold, distant CEO. He was just Alistair, a man in love. The ball was being held at the city's grandest hotel, a place of soaring marble columns and glittering crystal chandeliers. As they stepped out of the car and into the flash of paparazzi cameras, Clara felt a familiar pang of anxiety. This was his world, a world of power, of judgment, of people who could assess your entire net worth with a single, sweeping glance. He must have sensed her fear. He leaned in close, his hand finding hers, his touch a warm, steady anchor in the sea of noise and light. "Just stay with me," he whispered in her ear. "And remember, you are the most impressive person in this room, by a very wide margin." His words were a shield, and she walked into the ballroom with her head held high, her hand clasped firmly in his. The room was a who's who of the medical world. World-renowned surgeons, powerful hospital administrators, wealthy philanthropists, and of course, the 10 specialists from the Ashford case. Clara saw them across the room, huddled together, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and professional caution as they watched her and Alistair enter. For the first hour, they were a team. He guided her through the crowd, introducing her not as my girlfriend or the nurse, but with a simple, respectful pride. "This is Clara Monroe," he would say. "She is the brilliant mind behind the new treatment protocol at the Cromwell Institute." She handled the conversations with a grace and intelligence that surprised everyone. She spoke about her research, about her patient-centric philosophy, with a quiet passion that was more compelling than any corporate buzzword. She wasn't trying to impress them, she was simply sharing her truth. And they were captivated. The real test, however, came during the award ceremony. Alistair was the final honoree of the evening, receiving the prestigious Innovator of the Year award for his work in advanced diagnostics. As he walked to the stage, a thunderous applause filled the room. He stood at the podium, a figure of immense power and respect. He started his speech with the usual pleasantries, thanking the foundation, the board, his colleagues. Then he set his prepared notes aside. "I am here tonight to accept an award for innovation," he began, his voice ringing with a new, powerful sincerity. "But the truth is, the most profound innovation in my life this year did not happen in a laboratory. It happened in the quiet of a hospital room." He looked out into the crowd, his eyes finding Clara's. "I have spent my entire career believing that medicine was a science of data, of facts, of cold hard evidence," he continued. "I believed that the human element was a distraction. I was wrong. This year, I was confronted with a case that baffled me. And 10 of the best specialists in the world. We had all the data, all the technology, and we were failing. We were failing a sick child because we were looking at his charts and not at him." A hush fell over the room. "The person who solved that case," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was not a renowned specialist. She was a nurse. A woman who had the courage to trust her own observations, to listen to her patient, and to challenge a room full of experts who were too arrogant to see the simple truth that was right in front of them." He looked directly at Clara now, and it felt as if they were the only two people in the vast, glittering ballroom. "That woman is Clara Monroe, and she is not just the most brilliant diagnostician I have ever known. She is the most compassionate human being I have ever met. She didn't just innovate a treatment protocol. She taught me how to be a doctor again. She taught me how to be a man again." He raised the heavy crystal award. "This award," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that was absolute, "does not belong to me. It belongs to her." He walked off the stage, through the stunned, silent crowd, and directly to her table. He placed the award in front of her. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then, a single person in the back of the room began to clap. It was one of the specialists from the Ashford case. Another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. A thunderous, sustained standing ovation, not for him, but for her. Clara sat there, tears streaming down her face, completely overwhelmed. It was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound, humbling validation. He hadn't just defended her. He had given her the credit, the respect, the honor she had so richly deserved, on the biggest and most public stage imaginable. After the applause finally died down, and the evening began to wind down, they found themselves alone on a small, quiet terrace overlooking the city. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, her hand resting on the cool, heavy crystal of the award. "Yes," he said, turning to her and taking her hands in his. "I did, because it was the truth." He looked at her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights, his expression full of a love so deep it stole her breath. "Clara Monroe, you are my partner, my inspiration, and the absolute love of my life, and I am tired of just calling you my partner in private." He got down on one knee, right there on the cool stone of the terrace, high above the sleeping city. "I know this isn't a hospital room or a quiet chapel," he said, a small, nervous smile on his face as he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "But I cannot wait another day to ask you this." He opened the box. Inside was not a flashy, ostentatious diamond, but a simple, elegant ring, a thin platinum band with a single, flawless pearl. "I chose a pearl," he said, his voice a low, emotional murmur, Because it is born from a struggle. It starts as an irritation, a piece of grit, and it transforms it into something beautiful and strong. That's what you do. That's who you are. You take the grit and the pain of the world and you transform it into healing and into hope. He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. Clara Monroe, will you do me the profound honor of marrying me? Will you be my partner in transforming the rest of our lives into something beautiful? She was laughing and crying at the same time, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, she breathed, the word a happy sigh. Yes, Alistair Cromwell, 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and stood to pull her into his arms. And as he kissed her, with the whole glittering city as their witness, they both knew that their story was no longer just a quiet, private discovery. It was a beacon, a testament to the fact that the greatest innovations, in medicine and in life, are not born from data, but from the messy, beautiful, and profoundly powerful science of the human heart. The night of the Physicians' Foundation Ball was a declaration. The news of Dr. Alistair Cromwell's engagement to Nurse Clara Monroe, complete with his unprecedented heart-stopping speech, became the stuff of legend in the Seattle medical community. It was a story that had everything: romance, redemption, a stunning reversal of power dynamics, and a pearl ring that was infinitely more meaningful than a diamond. For Alistair and Clara, the days that followed were a blissful, surreal dream. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by the easy, comfortable intimacy of a couple who had not just fallen in love, but had fought a war together and won. They were no longer two separate entities navigating a complex professional landscape. They were a unit, a partnership, and the entire world seemed to rearrange itself around this new, unshakable truth. The first order of business was to tell Thomas Ashford. They went to the hospital together, not as doctor and nurse, but as Alistair and Clara. They found the boy in the hospital playroom, looking healthier and happier than ever, in the middle of an intense Lego construction project. Thomas, Alistair began, kneeling down beside him. Clara and I have some important news. We're getting married. Thomas looked from his Legos, his bright, intelligent eyes moving from Alistair's face to Clara's. He was silent for a moment, processing. Then a slow, wide grin spread across his face. Does that mean Clara is going to be my doctor now too? He asked. Alistair and Clara laughed. Nobody, Clara said, ruffling his hair. It just means I get to be a permanent part of your fan club. Good, Thomas said with the simple, profound wisdom of a child who has faced too much. Because you're the best. Planning the wedding became their new, shared project. Alistair's first instinct was to throw the biggest, most extravagant event the city had ever seen, a public celebration of the woman he adored. He envisioned a grand cathedral, 1,000 guests, an orchestra. Clara, in her gentle but firm way, brought him back down to earth. Alistair, she said one evening, as they were looking through a ridiculously opulent wedding planner's portfolio. Our story didn't happen in a cathedral, it happened in a hospital. It wasn't about 1,000 guests, it was about one little boy. I don't want a production, I want a promise. So they scrapped the grand plans. They decided to get married in the place that was most meaningful to them, the small, peaceful chapel at the Seattle Children's Hospital. The same chapel where he had found her at her lowest, and where he had first begun to realize the depth of his own failure and the strength of her spirit. The guest list would be small, just their closest friends, their families, and the medical staff who had become their second family. The announcement of their quiet, unconventional wedding plans sent another wave of shock through the city's elite circles. But Alistair didn't care. For the first time in his life, he was immune to the judgment of others. The only opinion that mattered was the one in Clara's kind, intelligent eyes. As they planned their future, they also revolutionized the present. Alistair, with Clara as his co-chair and moral compass, officially launched the Cromwell Monroe Foundation for Patient-Centric Medicine. Its mission was simple but radical: to fund research and develop programs that put the patient's story, not just their data, at the center of their care. It was a direct challenge to the cold, impersonal medical establishment he had once embodied. Clara, in turn, accepted a new formal role at the Institute. She was no longer a nurse or even a case lead. She became the first ever director of patient advocacy, a position Alistair created for her, giving her the power and the resources to implement her compassionate, holistic approach across the entire institution. She started training programs for doctors and nurses on the importance of narrative diagnostics, the art of listening to the human story behind the symptoms. The Cromwell Institute, once a fortress of cold science, was becoming a beacon of humanistic medicine. They were a formidable team, a perfect fusion of his resources and her vision. They were happy, fulfilled, and deeply in love. It was a perfect, beautiful life. And then, the past came knocking. It arrived in the form of a thin, unassuming man in a rumpled suit who showed up at the institute one afternoon asking to speak with Dr. Cromwell. His name was Peter Finney, and he was a lawyer. "Dr. Cromwell," Finney began, his voice quiet but firm, "I represent the estate of Eleanor Cromwell." Alistair froze. Eleanor was his mother's name. But his mother had passed away 25 years ago. Her estate had been settled decades ago. "I believe you're mistaken," Alistair said. "My mother's affairs have been in order for a very long time." "I am not referring to your mother, Dr. Cromwell," Finney said, placing a manila folder on Alistair's desk. "I am referring to your grandmother, Eleanor Cromwell, your father's mother." Alistair stared at him, completely bewildered. "My grandmother died before I was born, and my father?" He never spoke of her. Ever. "I am aware of that," Finney said, "which is why this may come as a shock." He opened the folder. Inside was a copy of a last will and testament, dated 50 years ago. "Your grandmother, upon her death, left her entire personal fortune, including a significant portfolio of early-stage pharmaceutical stocks, in a blind trust. A trust that was to be managed by my firm, with one very specific instruction." He slid the document across the desk. The trust was to remain untouched until the year her first great-grandchild was born, and its entire contents were to be bequeathed not to her son or her grandson, but to the woman who would one day marry her grandson and dedicate her life to the healing arts. Alistair's world tilted on its axis. He read the clause, the legalistic language a stark contrast to the unbelievable fairy-tale nature of its content. "My grandmother was a nurse," Finney explained gently. "Before she married into the Cromwell family, it was her passion, her calling. But my grandfather, a man of his time, asked her to give it up. He wanted a society wife. She complied, but it was the great sadness of her life. She created this trust in secret, a way of ensuring that her legacy of compassionate care would one day find its way to a woman who shared her values, a woman like your fiancée." Alistair was speechless. He thought of his cold, distant father, a man who had never once spoken of his own mother. He now understood why. His grandmother's will was a silent, posthumous rebellion, a final, powerful statement against the cold, unfeeling world her husband and son had built. "The value of the trust," Finney continued, "after 50 years of compound growth, is considerable. The pharmaceutical stocks she invested in, one of them became a global giant. The current valuation is approximately $150 million. If Alistair had been holding a glass of water, he would have dropped it. And it all," Finney concluded, a small, satisfied smile on his face, "belongs to Miss Clara Monroe." That evening, Alistair sat in the quiet of his study, the legal documents spread out before him, a story more unbelievable than any he had ever encountered. He thought about Clara, about her simple, unpretentious life, about her quiet dedication to helping others. And now she was in her own right an heiress, a woman of immense wealth. A strange, unexpected feeling crept into his heart. It wasn't envy, it was fear. Their relationship had been built on a specific dynamic. He was the powerful, wealthy benefactor. She was the compassionate, humble healer. He had found his purpose in supporting her, in using his resources to lift her up. But now she didn't need him, not in the same way. She could fund her own foundations, build her own hospitals, change the world on her own terms. Would she still need him? Would their partnership, a partnership built in the crucible of his redemption, survive this new, shocking equality? He heard the front door open and close. It was Clara, back from a long day at the hospital. He heard her cheerful greeting to the housekeeper, the sound of her putting her keys in the bowl by the door, the small, familiar rituals that had become the soundtrack of his happiness. She walked into the study, a tired but happy smile on her face. "Long day," she said, coming over to kiss his cheek. "There was a little girl on the ward today who..." She stopped, noticing the strange, somber expression on his face. "Alistair, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way," he said, his voice quiet. "I have." He stood up and handed her the folder. "You need to read this," he said. She took the documents, a puzzled look on her face. She sat down in the leather armchair opposite his desk and began to read. He watched her face, watched her expression shift from confusion to disbelief to a kind of quiet, profound shock that mirrored his own. When she finished, she just sat there for a long time, the papers resting in her lap, her eyes distant. $150 million, she whispered, the words sounding absurd in the quiet room. "Yes," he said. She looked up at him, and her eyes were not filled with the triumphant joy he might have expected. They were filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper, and he knew, with a sinking heart, that she was having the exact same fear that he was. The beautiful, simple story they had written together had just been given a new, complicated, and terrifyingly wealthy plot twist, and neither of them knew how to write the next chapter. The news of the inheritance didn't bring celebration. It brought a quiet, unnerving silence into the mansion. The $150 million, a sum that should have been a joyous, life-altering miracle, instead felt like a ghost, a third presence in their relationship, casting long, complicated shadows over the simple, beautiful thing they had built. For the first few days, they barely spoke of it. They moved through their routines with a careful, deliberate normalcy, but the topic of the inheritance was a tangible, unspoken thing between them. It was there at the breakfast table when she poured his coffee. It was there in the car on the way to the hospital. It was there in the quiet of the evenings, a question mark hanging in the air. Alistair watched her, his heart filled with a quiet anxiety. He saw the new weight she was carrying. She seemed more withdrawn, more thoughtful, the easy, joyful laughter that he had come to cherish now a rarer and more precious commodity. He wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but he didn't know how. He, a man who had spent his life defined by his wealth, was now terrified that this new wealth would be the very thing that drove her away. He was afraid that she would no longer see him, Alistair, the man she had taught to be human, but would instead see him as a reflection of a world she had never wanted to be a part of. Clara, for her part, was adrift in a sea of overwhelming possibility and profound confusion. Her entire life had been defined by a quiet, noble struggle. Her identity was forged in the fires of necessity, of making do, of finding joy and purpose in a world of scarcity. Now that world had been obliterated. The familiar landscape of her life was gone, replaced by a new, terrifyingly vast horizon. She would lie awake at night, the number echoing in her head. $150 million. It wasn't just money, it was a responsibility, a power she had never asked for. Who was she, if not the nurse who worked double shifts, the woman who found creative ways to stretch a small budget? If she could now simply write a check to solve any problem, would she lose the very essence of the person Alistair had fallen in love with? The resourceful, resilient woman who saw the world from the ground up? She was afraid of losing herself. And she was afraid of losing him. The first crack in their silent stalemate came a week later. They were in a planning meeting for the Cromwell Monroe Foundation. Clara was presenting a proposal for a new mobile clinic to serve rural communities. "The initial budget is tight," she was explaining to the board. "We'll have to start with a used van and limited equipment, but if we're creative with our resources." "Or," Alistair interjected, his tone meant to be helpful, but coming across as purely transactional, "we could simply allocate $2 million from your new resources and build a state-of-the-art clinic from the ground up. It would be more efficient." The room went silent. The other board members looked from Alistair to Clara, sensing the sudden, sharp drop in temperature. Clara's face was a mask of polite, controlled fury. "Thank you for the input, Dr. Cromwell," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "However, the point of this project is not just to provide services. It's to build trust. Showing up in a shiny, multi-million-dollar clinic can be intimidating. Starting small, with a creative use of resources, is a way of showing the community that we understand their world. It's a matter of empathy, not efficiency." Her words were a gentle but public rebuke. She had not just corrected his business assessment, she had corrected his entire worldview, the very one she had worked so hard to change. The car ride home was a tomb of icy silence. "You embarrassed me in there," Alistair said finally, his voice tight. "No," she replied, her own voice trembling with a hurt she could no longer hide. "You embarrassed yourself. You reverted back to the man I first met. The man who thinks money is the answer to everything. The man who sees people as a problem to be solved with a check." "I was just trying to help," he shot back, his frustration boiling over. "I was trying to make things easier for you." "I don't need you to make things easier for me," she cried, the words a torrent of pent-up fear and frustration. "My entire life has been about making things work when they weren't easy. That's who I am. And I am terrified that this money, that your world, is going to sand down all my rough edges until there's nothing left of the woman you fell in love with." He pulled the car over to the side of the road, the engine a low hum in the sudden quiet. He turned to her, his own face a mask of pain and confusion. "And I'm terrified," he confessed, his voice a raw whisper, "that you won't need me anymore. My whole life, my value has been tied to what I can provide. You were the first person who seemed to see past that. But now that you have your own resources, what's my role? What do I have to offer you, if not my help?" And there it was, the truth, the raw, vulnerable, terrified heart of the matter. They were both afraid of the same thing, that the new circumstances would erase the very foundations of their love. She looked at him, at the genuine fear in his eyes, and her anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching love. She reached out and took his hand. "Alistair," she said softly, "I didn't fall in love with your money. I didn't fall in love with your help. I fell in love with the man who had the courage to sit in a hospital chapel and admit he was wrong. I fell in love with the man who was willing to learn a new way to live. Your money doesn't change that. It doesn't define you unless you let it, and it doesn't define me." She squeezed his hand. "What do you have to offer me? You offer your heart, your partnership, your ridiculous, endearing attempts to be a good man. That's all I've ever wanted, and that's all I'll ever need." He looked at her, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "So what do we do with this ghost?" he asked. "This money that's sitting between us?" She was quiet for a moment, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. "I think," she said, "that we do what your grandmother wanted all along. We use it to change the world, together." That conversation was the key, the one that unlocked the final door. The fear, once spoken, lost its power. They were no longer two separate people wrestling with a problem. They were a team again, facing a challenge together. They spent the next few weeks not planning their wedding, but planning the future of the inheritance. It was the most exciting, most fulfilling project of their lives. They decided to use the entire $150 million to create a new, independent charitable trust, completely separate from the Cromwell Monroe Foundation. "The foundation is about fixing the problems within the system," Clara argued. This should be about building a new one." They called it the Eleanor Trust, in honor of the two Eleanor Cromwells, the grandmother who had planted the seed of hope, and the wife whose loss had, in its own tragic way, set Alistair on the path to finding himself. The Trust's mission was bold and simple: to fund the impossible ideas, the grassroots, community-led projects that were too small, too chaotic, or too radical for traditional philanthropy. Clara, with her deep, intuitive understanding of what communities truly needed, was the heart of the Trust. Alistair, with his financial acumen, was its brain. They were a perfect symbiotic whole. They traveled the country together, not to fancy resorts, but to small towns, to inner-city neighborhoods, listening to the stories of people who had been forgotten and finding ways to invest in their dreams. They found their new dynamic in this shared purpose. He learned from her how to listen, how to see the value in a small human-scale idea. She learned from him how to think big, how to scale a project, how to turn a good idea into a sustainable, world-changing reality. Their love, which had been born in the quiet of a hospital, was now being forged in the fire of a shared mission. They were not just a couple. They were partners in the truest sense of the word. One evening, after a long but incredibly rewarding day, visiting a project in a rural Appalachian town. They were sitting on the porch of a small, rustic inn, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. "You know," Clara said, her head resting on his shoulder. "This is it. This is the life I always dreamed of. Not the money, but this. The feeling that we're a part of something bigger than ourselves." "Me too," he said, his voice a contented murmur. He then turned to her, a playful glint in his eye. "But you do realize that now that you're technically a philanthropist with a 9-figure trust fund, you're officially part of my world. You've become one of the elites." She laughed, a real, joyful sound that echoed in the quiet country air. "Don't you worry, Dr. Cromwell," she said, poking him in the ribs. "I will always be the nurse who knows that the best cure for an inflated ego is a good dose of reality, and I promise to administer it daily." He pulled her closer, his heart full. "I'm counting on it," he said. He knew with an absolute certainty that their greatest adventure was just beginning. And it was a story he couldn't wait to write with her, chapter by beautiful, unpredictable chapter. The wedding of Dr. Alistair Cromwell and Clara Monroe was not a social event. It was a gathering of souls. They chose to be married in the place that had become the heart of their new life. The small, rustic community center in the Appalachian town they had been supporting through the Eleanor Trust. The entire town, it seemed, was involved in the preparations. The farmers provided the flowers, the town baker made the cake, and a bluegrass band, made up of a retired coal miner and his 2 sons, provided the music. The guests were a beautiful, chaotic mix of their 2 worlds. The board of directors from the Cromwell Institute, looking slightly bewildered but deeply moved in their expensive suits, sat on hay bales next to the town's mayor and a group of local artisans. Thomas Ashford, now a healthy, vibrant 11-year-old, served as Alistair's best man, a role he took with a solemn pride that was both adorable and heartbreakingly mature. Clara's family, a loud, loving, sprawling clan, had traveled from all over the country, instantly embracing the townspeople as their own. Clara didn't wear a designer gown. She wore a simple, elegant dress made of hand-spun linen, a gift from a women's weaving cooperative the Eleanor Trust had funded. It was the color of cream, with delicate wildflowers embroidered along the hem. She looked not like a bride from a magazine, but like a queen of a small, beautiful kingdom. A queen of hearts. Alistair waited for her under a massive, ancient oak tree at the edge of a meadow. He watched her walk towards him, escorted by a dozen giggling children from the community center, each one carrying a small, hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers. And he felt a sense of peace so profound it felt like coming home. Their vows were not spoken to the crowd, but whispered to each other, a private conversation in a public space. "Clara," Alistair began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You came into my life as a question I didn't know how to ask. You were the data point that broke my every algorithm. You taught me that a life measured only in success is a life half-lived. You are my partner, my compass, my heart. And I promise to spend every day of my life learning the beautiful, complicated, and infinitely wonderful language of your soul." Clara, her own eyes shining with tears, responded with a quiet, powerful sincerity. "Alistair," she said, her hands holding his. "You were a fortress, and I was just a woman with a small, stubborn notebook. But you let me in. You had the courage not just to listen, but to change. You taught me that even the most guarded hearts can learn to heal, and that the greatest strength is the willingness to be vulnerable. I promise to be your partner in every storm and your co-conspirator in every quiet joy. I promise to build a life with you that is not just successful, but significant." When the town's elderly pastor pronounced them husband and wife, a joyful cheer erupted from the assembled crowd, a sound that echoed through the quiet, green hills. Their first kiss as a married couple was a perfect reflection of them. A little bit shy, a little bit awkward, and filled with a love that was as deep and as real as the ancient mountains that surrounded them. The reception was a joyous, communal feast. Long wooden tables were laden with homemade food. The bluegrass band played songs that made everyone, from the stuffy board members to the small children, want to clap their hands and stomp their feet. Alistair, the man who had once been terrified of human connection, found himself in a deep conversation with a retired farmer about the science of soil regeneration. "Clara," the woman who had once been invisible, was the radiant center of it all, a beacon of warmth and joy. Later that evening, as the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, they found a quiet moment away from the celebration. They were sitting on a small hand-carved bench overlooking the valley. "Happy, Mrs. Cromwell?" he asked, wrapping his arm around her. "I'm not sure happy is a big enough word for this," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It feels more like grace." He was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother," he said softly, "the one who left you the inheritance. I think she would have loved this. I think this is exactly the kind of story she was hoping to write." "We're a part of her story now," Clara said, "and she's a part of ours." Their life together was a beautiful, ongoing collaboration. They didn't just merge their lives, they created a new one, a life dedicated to the principle they had discovered together. That true healing, for people and for communities, comes from a combination of resources and respect, of data and dignity. The Cromwell Institute, under Alistair's new, human-centric leadership, became a global leader in compassionate medicine. The Eleanor Trust, under Clara's visionary guidance, became a revolutionary force in philanthropy, proving that small, targeted investments in human potential could yield the greatest returns of all. They built their home not in a sterile city penthouse, but in a sprawling old farmhouse in the countryside, a place with a big, messy garden, a slightly leaky roof, and enough room for their ever-expanding, unconventional family. They filled it with books, with music, with laughter, and with a revolving door of friends, colleagues, and the occasional stray dog Clara couldn't resist bringing home. 2 years after their wedding, their family grew. They had a daughter, a beautiful, bright-eyed girl with her father's thoughtful gaze and her mother's joyful, infectious laugh. They named her Eleanor, in honor of the two women whose quiet rebellions had, in their own ways, made their love story possible. Their life was not a fairy tale, it was real. It had its challenges, its disagreements, its moments of exhaustion. He still, on occasion, reverted to his data-driven CEO mode. She still, on occasion, tried to carry the weight of the entire world on her own shoulders. But they had learned to be partners. They had learned to talk, to listen, to forgive. They had learned that love was not a destination, but a daily practice, a constant, conscious choice to see the best in each other. One evening, several years later, they were sitting on the porch of their farmhouse, watching a now teenage Thomas Ashford teach their own young daughter, Ellie, how to identify the constellations in the night sky. Thomas, who had been the catalyst for their entire journey, was now a bright, healthy, and incredibly kind young man, a beloved part of their extended family, who was planning to go to medical school himself. "You know," Alistair said, his voice a low, contented murmur as he took Clara's hand, "I spent the first half of my life trying to control every variable, to eliminate every risk. I thought that was strength." He looked at his wife, at the woman who had taught him everything that mattered. "But real strength," he said, "is having the courage to embrace the unknown. It's having the faith to believe in the goodness of people. It's knowing that the most valuable data in the world can't be found on a chart, but in the quiet, steady beat of a loving heart." Clara smiled, her eyes shining in the soft glow of the porch light. "That was almost poetic, Dr. Cromwell." "I had a good teacher," he replied, leaning in to kiss her. Their story had begun in a world of cold, hard facts, of diagnoses and data, but it had become a testament to a truth far more profound, that the most powerful force for healing in the universe is not science or money or power, but the simple, revolutionary, and life-altering act of truly seeing another person's soul. And in finding each other, they had not just built a foundation or a family, they had discovered a cure for the one condition that had plagued them both: a lonely heart. What did you think of the story of Alistair and Clara? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey of healing and love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the end, who believes that compassion is the greatest science of all, please comment with a simple "healed." We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will touch your soul.